So a new 40-year high on this inflation rate. A lot of folks will be saying, what is the administration doing about it? The job of fighting inflation is the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve will likely start raising interest rates. This adds more kind of conversation or more evidence to this big debate happening. How quickly will the Fed start raising interest rates and when? Ironically, the solution to fast inflation is raising interest rates for American consumers, which raises their borrowing costs. So the solution to this is something that Americans will feel in their pocketbook as well.
Yeah, and for people on a limited income, it means the thermostat is going to go down, right? Or it's going to go up in the summer, and they're going to go without some food. That's a very real possibility, Christine. Thank you so much for taking us through that. That's cute.
First, breaking news on the U.S. economy. Inflation has reached a near 40-year high of 7.5%. We'll break down all of the numbers in just a moment.
With news on inflation, CNN chief business correspondent Christine Romans covering, as well as White House correspondent Arlette Saenz. Christine, I do want to begin with you. It's a 40-year high, consistent with the numbers we saw last year. So basically saying inflation is staying above the 7% level?
It is still running hot. 7.5% is the year-over-year level. And when I look into the month-to-month, a bit of a disappointment there, 0.6% increase. We had seen that moderating, but not in the most recent month. Driving this food, electricity, and shelter, those are things that you can't really skimp on in many cases. The trend, Jim, when you look at the trend here, you can see a big spike in the last 4 or 5 months on this chart. So you have the highest inflation since February 1982. We're talking 4 decades here. Let me dig inside those numbers. Gas up 40%. These again are year-over-year numbers. A little bit of moderation month to month. I don't expect that to continue. Used cars up more than 40%. Imagine if you have to buy a used car right now, how much more you're paying this year than last year, and certainly compared with the pandemic. Food at home up 7.4%. Electricity up 11%. That spike really driving a lot of this overall number. Rents up, apparel up, just about everything you can imagine is up here. You're going to have to raise interest rates and raise borrowing costs to try to tamp down some of the pain of higher inflation. Either way, consumers feel it.
And we were just talking about this off camera. It was just a few years ago where this was sort of inside baseball talk, and inflation was not part of the daily vernacular, right, for Americans. Here we are, a completely different story, and Americans really feeling it. And this brings us to the White House and their views on this. John Harwood is there. And the White House, John, previously said that they wouldn't be surprised if this number was around 7%. This is clearly higher than estimates had called for. What is the state within the White House in terms of their response to this? And, of course, what they can't control, whatever the Fed decides.
That's right, Deanna. And I think the most disappointing number that was in this report is the month-to-month figure that Christine made a reference to. Everybody knows, and we have been running for a couple of months, 7% inflation, highest in 40 years. But what they've been counting on is a deceleration, and that had gone on for a couple of months, did not happen in January. That's disappointing. Now, you still have economists predicting that inflation will temper over the course of the year, but any month where that does not happen, the more the confidence in those predictions gets shaky. I think it's important to note that there's still many workers who are coming out ahead of inflation, especially at the bottom end of the wage scale, but there's a significant number in the middle who are not, and that's fueling the political problems for the Biden administration. Now, the president's going to be talking today about drug prices and about how his political agenda would rein in prices for drugs like insulin and provide some other practical assistance with costs for ordinary Americans, but he doesn't have the votes as of yet to pass his program in Congress. And the longer that inflation remains a top-of-mind concern for Americans, the more troublesome that is politically for the Biden administration.
No question. And you're right, John. We had Jared Bernstein on a short time ago who was predicting, or at least hoping for, a deceleration. Good morning. I'm Jim Sciutto. A dire warning from one of America's largest banks. J.P. Morgan says oil could easily hit $120 per barrel. This if tensions between Russia and Ukraine escalate. This as inflation tops 7.5%. That is the highest level in 40 years. Plus this, new images this morning of U.S. fighter jets arriving in Poland as Russia launches joint military drills in Belarus. Details on what the U.S. and European allies are watching as possible signals of an invasion by Russia.
And back here at home, the National Archives asking the DOJ to investigate former President Trump's handling of White House records. This after boxes of documents were recovered from Mar-a-Lago. And details from a new book this morning reveal former staffers believe the former president tried to flush some documents at the White House.
More than once. But we begin this morning with the inflation news. CNN's Matt Egan following all of this. So, Matt, a number consistent with what we saw in December, but crucially not tailing off at all, which is what the White House had said they hope to see in the early part of this year.
Yeah, Jim Biana, that's right. This is really another brutal report on the cost of living. I mean, inflation can't get better until it stops getting worse, but we haven't seen that yet. You know, consumer prices up by 7.5% from a year ago. That's the most since 1982. Almost 40 years ago, exactly. And remember, the Federal Reserve's goal here is for 2% inflation. We're nowhere near that. Now, there have been some hope that maybe there'd be signs of progress month to month, right? That maybe between December and January, prices would actually cool off. That didn't happen either. We saw prices up by 0.6%. Let me just give you a few concrete examples of what we're talking about. Gasoline up 40% year over year. Used cars, 40%. Food at home, 7.4%. Electricity, nearly 11%. Now, context is crucial here. There's a lot of positive about the economy. I mean, GDP last year grew at the fastest pace since 1984. Unemployment rate down to nearly 4%, to exactly 4%. It was at almost 15% April 2020. But the high cost of living, you know, continues to overshadow all of that. And today's report just feels like another setback on the inflation front.
Yeah, and the administration had at least been hoping to see signs of inflation tampering there. Meantime, for many Americans wondering why they should be concerned about what's happening thousands of miles away in Ukraine and Russia, new warning about the economic consequences potentially. JP Morgan saying that oil prices could go up substantially.
Yeah, this situation with Russia and Ukraine is clearly a geopolitical crisis, and it could be a humanitarian tragedy, but there's also potentially going to be economic consequences that could impact virtually all Americans. You know, JP Morgan putting out this report talking about how Russia is the world's #2 oil producer at a time when supplies are pretty tight right now. Let me read you a key line from this JP Morgan analysis. They wrote, quote, any disruptions to oil flows from Russia in the context of low spare capacity in other regions could easily send oil prices to $120 a barrel. Easily. They also added that if Russia's oil exports are cut in half, and that's a big if because we know Moscow needs oil revenue too, but if they were cut in half, prices would spike to $150 a barrel. That, of course, would only drive up prices at the pump, which are already high. The national average hitting $3.48 a gallon today. That's a fresh 7-year high, up 7 cents from a week ago, exactly $1 higher than a year ago. Keep in mind, these latest gains in gas prices, they're not captured in today's inflation report. I think all of this is just one more reason why what happens next on the Russia-Ukraine front will be so consequential to really people around the world.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and Russia is going to leverage that, right? The threat of higher prices as it continues to threaten the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Matt Egan, thanks so much.
CNN breaking news.
Hello, everyone. I'm Kate Baldwin. We begin with breaking news. Inflation in the United States soaring to its highest level in 4 decades. Consumer prices jumped 7.5% compared to a year ago, the steepest annual increase since February 1982. This has real implications for every American, and it is a number the Biden administration cannot and will not ignore today. CNN's Matt Egan is here with more on this. Matt, what are you seeing here in this latest data?
Well, Kate, inflation is hot, and it keeps getting hotter. There have been some expectation that today's report might show some signs of progress. Unfortunately, that did not happen, and that is really disappointing for families dealing with the high cost of living, for the Federal Reserve, which has been pretty slow to shift to inflation-fighting mode, and, of course, the White House. So consumer prices up by 7.5% in January from the year before, biggest since 1982. And month over month, there had been an expectation that maybe inflation would cool off. That did not happen, as you can see, up by 0.6. If you look at that line chart, you can see that inflation is going straight up. Now, the Fed's goal is 2%. We're nowhere near there. Let me give you some concrete examples of what we're talking about when we talk about inflation, because we saw record price spikes on a number of categories. New cars and trucks up by more than 12% from a year ago, fresh fish and seafood nearly 13%, restaurant meals, furniture and bedding, appliances, all of them record price gains in January. Also, gas prices keep going up. That was actually not reflected in today's report. There's a lot of positives about today's economy. Unemployment down to 4%, GDP last year at the fastest since 1984. But Kate, high inflation continues to loom ominously over this economic recovery.
Absolutely. Matt, thanks for laying it out. I really appreciate it. Joining me now for more on this, let's go to the White House. Jared Bernstein is with us, a member of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. Jared, we've got a ton to discuss, but let's talk about, let's just start here. Gas, 40% more expensive than a year ago. Used cars, 40% more expensive than a year ago. Food, 7.5% more expensive than a year ago. Electricity, almost 11% more expensive than a year ago. You have said it, this is a real problem. Can you make the case that this is getting better?
Okay, first of all, you hear there's a very big helicopter taking off behind me with a very important person in it. We can certainly make the case that, as you just reported, this is a challenge that is first and foremost in our sights at the White House. The president has two top economic priorities. One is to make sure that we have the fastest growing economy, the tightest job market, offering great opportunities for any comers who want to come into this job market. The second is to do all we can to ameliorate these price pressures. Now, there is some light in this report under the hood. It's not quite as grim as your reporting suggests. So, for example, auto prices, which make about a quarter of headline inflation over the past year, they did moderate a bit in January. As you mentioned, gas prices were down a bit, but that's a very volatile number. It's going to jump around from month to month. Real wages over the month, from December to January, real wages were actually slightly up. They actually beat inflation. But look, we have to continue to do all we can to unsnarl supply chains at the ports, to make sure goods get from ship to shelf with great speed, and that involves our trucking agenda, and to make sure that over the longer term we're expanding the economy's productive capacity with the CHIPS Act, $50 billion invested in domestic semiconductor capacity.
But this isn't good news, what came out today.
Sorry?
This is not good news, though, that came out today.
Look, anytime you have inflation this elevated, that's even beating expectations, it's an absolute challenge for American households. But we also have to look at the bigger picture. What are we doing to help? Is it helping? So at the ports, we know that the time that containers are spending in the ports is down significantly over the past few months. We know that shelves are stocked only 2 percentage points below where they were before this pandemic. We know that our competition agenda is out there helping to encourage price savings to be passed along to consumers. Meat prices actually fell in this report. Again, a monthly number. I don't want to make too much out of 1 month. But if you get under the hood, you see where some of our interventions are helping. Broad picture, though, we have way more work to do. You're absolutely right.
Broad picture, do you expect inflation to remain above the 2% target throughout 2022?
I expect inflation to come down significantly in 2022. Now, more to the point, that's not just my expectation. That's the expectation of every forecast I've looked at, and it's very important. Basically, what the forecasts tell you is that the job market should stay tight and get even tighter, supporting wage growth, while inflation decelerates, while it slows. So virtually every forecast has inflation growing about half as fast this year as it did last year. Now, half as fast still might take you above the Fed's target, but if that occurs, that's going to be a real sign that some of our interventions, some market interventions, are helping to ease these price pressures.
President Biden on December 10th said that he thought inflation was at its peak. The quote was, "I think it's the peak of the crisis." It was not. And I remember very clearly our conversations over the summer when you were talking about inflation being transitory. It was not. Are you guys being clear-eyed enough about what is going on here?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the thing to recognize is that our team, at the insistence of the president, is focused on not just the month-to-month ups and downs, but on the underlying trends. And there you have to appreciate the fact that
but
GDP
I'm talking
growth,
about underlying trends. The trends are
yeah,
not...
Well, and
Go ahead.
So that and so that's the point. We're going to get some months that come in better, some months that come in worse. Probably when the president said that, Omicron wasn't quite in the picture yet. So the virus is still upon the land. We are reacting to real data, just like we got here today. This data tells us that we have to continue to press on every effort we can to unsnarl supply chains, to get goods through the ports, to get the trucks moving, to make sure that our competition agenda is helping consumers to realize price gains, to realize price savings, and longer term to increase the economy's productive capacity by getting people into the job market with our care agenda, our prescription drugs agenda, and bringing down the costs of drugs, healthcare, education. This is all legislation we have to press going forward.
You mentioned supply chain. The current protests in Canada, they're impacting the United States now. 2 Ford engine plants in Windsor, they had to stop.
Harry Litman,
Right.
Gloria Borger, thank you both very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Claire.
Okay, so inflation just hit a near 40-year high. When will there be a reprieve for your wallet, and what action will the Fed take next? Almost everything costs a lot more. And today we got some numbers that put that in stark relief. Over the past 12 months, inflation in the U.S. soared to its highest level in 40 years, driving consumer prices 7.5% higher than the same time last year. That's the steepest annual hike since 1982. CNN business reporter Matt Egan joins us now to break down the new inflation numbers. Matt, was this a surprise how high these are?
Well, Allison, we knew inflation was high. Today, we found out it's getting worse, and that means that your paycheck's not going as far as it used to. This 7.5% jump in consumer prices, that's an acceleration from 7% in December. It's going in the wrong direction. In May, inflation was at 5%. We thought that was bad. It's way above that now. Not only that, but there was an expectation that month over month, prices might cool off a bit. The opposite happened. Now, if you zoom out, we have a chart showing inflation for the last 40 some odd years. And you can see that for a very long time, inflation was very low. But as you can see on the right, the chart shows that prices are going basically straight up. The last time we saw a number like this was 1982. That was a long time ago. E.T. was the top movie then. I was not alive yet. What is startling about...
That tells me a lot.
Yes, although if I was, I would have been looking at the inflation report, of course.
Yeah, you would.
But what's startling about this report is that it just shows that inflation is really widespread. I mean, we saw record price spikes on new cars and trucks, fresh fish, restaurant meals, appliances, furniture prices up 17%, new cars and trucks up, and that was before these disruptions being caused by the protests on the border with Canada. We do have to put this into context. There's a lot of positives, right? GDP was up by the most last year since 1984, unemployment down to 4%, but Allison, the high cost of living continues to be a sore spot.
Does this change the Fed's plan?
It might. There's a growing sense that the Fed is late, that it was slow to acknowledge that inflation wasn't just going to be transitory. It was slow to shift into inflation fighting mode. And so now the Fed has to catch up. There's a growing expectation on Wall Street that the Fed is going to have to raise interest rates multiple times. A few months ago, the debate was maybe 2 times, 3 times. Now the debate is 4, 5, 6, maybe 7 times. Investors are even starting to price in the growing chance that the Fed may raise interest rates by 0.5 percentage point in March's meeting. We haven't seen anything like that since the year 2000. It would be a way for the Fed to show that it really means business on inflation. This is not sitting well with investors, though. We see the Dow is down sharply today. Initially took the inflation report, which in stride, but now down 540 points, 1.5%. You got to remember, rock bottom interest rates were great for the stock market. It essentially forced people to bet on stocks. Higher rates will be a challenge, and we could see some more turbulence in the stock market going forward.
Okay, Matt, thank you very much for all of that. And I'm going to take you to see E.T. at some point.
Please do.
Okay. Meanwhile, let's discuss all of this with Austan Goolsbee. He was the chairman of the White House Council of Economic Advisors under Barack Obama. He's now an economics professor at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. Austan, great to see you. Okay, so in December, President Biden said that he felt that inflation was at its peak. That was wrong. Today, we got these, incredibly striking numbers, the highest inflation since 1982. Is there a way to know when inflation will be at its peak, and when do you think that is?
Well, there is one sense in which the way we quote inflation is different than the way we quote job numbers, which is when you get 1 month of new inflation and you staple it to the previous 11 months of inflation, so it's a trailing measure of inflation. The month to month is still high, but it didn't go up from last month. It's just remained at this high level.
Oh, I thought it went
You
from
wanna
7%
see
to
those
7.5.
new months coming down. That's how you know when you're at the peak. They'll start coming down.
Okay, and when will that happen?
The